In this lesson for the portrait sculpting course, we're going to be talking about sculpting the portrait from imagination. Imagination. You can do this assignment any size, but I recommend about half-life size or a little bit smaller. The larger the sculpture, the longer the sculpt. I'll be working about half-life size for this male portrait sculpture. Depending on the size you're working, you may want an armature. Here I'm using a baseboard with a 1/2 inch floor flange and a 1/2 inch by 8 inch metal pipe. And then on top of that, I put some crumpled paper and a plastic bag around it and build the block-in on top of that. For the block-in, I'm using the Bota method block-in, which is that wedge shape that tapers towards the front plane of the face. This is a nice, solid, and simple foundation to start sculpting on top of. Next, we can establish the side profile of the portrait, and this is where we're going to try to design the character that we're sculpting. I'm trying to go for a pretty generic, average male head. From the portrait, we should be able to tell whether it's a male or female, young or old, attractive or ugly, thin or fat. And so there's a lot of information that can go into just that side profile. Take your time on the profile and don't move on until you feel like the angles are correct and the shape of the features look good and you're happy with the type of character that you're sculpting. Once this profile outline is in place, then we can move on to the bony structures. You can use a knife to draw in some guidelines of those bony features before you add the pieces of clay. When sculpting these bony features, I like to give an indication of the eye socket, cheekbones, or the zygomatic arch, the jawbone and the angle of the jaw, and the superior temporal line. We also want to give some mass for the tooth cylinder, or the dental mound. Try to do this as best you can from memory without using any reference. This helps you know what areas of the skull you may want to pay special attention to in future sculpting sessions. Skull is really important. There's a bunch of lessons that go over sculpting the skull. If you have a good, solid understanding of the skull, it'll make inventing portraits so much easier. It really is the framework of the face. Then we'll move on to the front view and try to capture the essence of the character from the front. This means adding some thickness to the neck, adding in the sternocleidomastoid muscles and the trapezius, and making sure that we have the high points of the skull in the right location. For example, look at the shape of the head and look for that egg shape with the widest point about here towards the back of the head, and then it tapers as it moves towards the chin. Remember to make sure that there's enough mass in the back of the skull, the cranial mass of the skull. All of these bony features will bring us a little bit closer to the surface of the sculpture and give us more information for laying in the features and the secondary forms. Once we've established these bony features with walls of clay, and once we feel like they're symmetrical from side to side, then we can take some clay and fill in the safe areas in between these bony forms. Then we can move on to the next stage and start working on the secondary forms and the anatomy. Sculpting the portrait from imagination can be really fun, but there's a reason that I've waited for this assignment until we've had some practice doing the individual facial features and going over a lot of the anatomy and other lessons. So hopefully you've already done the self-portrait sculpture, the sculpting the facial features, and the other assignments before working on this assignment. There's so much complexity and so much variation from person to person, so having some knowledge and some resources that you can go back to and having some experience sculpting these features from references, those are things that you'll be able to draw on when you're sculpting new characters from imagination. As you're sculpting, I recommend following those 10 steps to a successful portrait sculpture that I went over in a previous lesson. Of course, you'll take out the step of collecting references, but following those steps can be really helpful to give the sculpting process structure as you're inventing a new portrait. With super complex areas like the eyes, just try to remember the structure around them and the things that we went over in our lesson on sculpting the eyes. What I like to do is just lay in the top eyelid with a coil of clay, and then I can move that around if it needs to, and then lay in the lower eyelid below that to shape the area around the eye. A lot of the mistakes come at the beginning of the process, and if you don't build up the structure of the skull and structure of the face accurately, then when you put the features on top of that, things still tend to look strange. So having a record of those early stages can be really helpful. Don't get too frustrated if areas like the eyes, nose, mouth, or the ears are not coming along exactly as you want. Now might be a good time to like the video and subscribe to the channel. For this stage of the process, it really does help to have an understanding of the fat pads of the face, and I went over those in a premium lesson. The more knowledge you have, the easier it is to invent. One of the benefits of this assignment is that it lets you know where you struggle and the features that you don't quite understand. Let's say you're sculpting an ear, for example, and you don't remember those basic forms that we talked about in our lesson on sculpting the ear, the question mark, Y, U shapes, and how those fit into the ear. If you don't have those simplified shapes in mind, then the ear becomes very difficult. So this assignment of doing the sculpture from imagination just really helps you know where you're at and what features that you should study a little bit more. Take your time and just do the best you can to build out these features as accurately as possible. Because we're not sculpting a specific person, you just want it to look believable, like someone could look like that. This means capturing accurate depths and the softness and subtlety between the facial features, and also keeping in mind how the facial features flow into one another. Try to avoid harsh and sharp transitions between the features unless you're going for wrinkles in an old face or something like that. Usually soft and subtle is a better way to go. And with this sculpture, I didn't even add the eyeball itself, but you can see that if you just get the structure around the eye socket and then the eyelids accurately, you almost don't need that eyeball itself to capture that lifelike realism. As you're moving through the process, you can use a mirror or take a picture of the sculpture to see it on a 2D plane. And this just helps me catch some of the errors that I might have missed when I was just looking directly at the sculpture. Now we can start working on the details, adding things like the hairline and some hair, and finishing up the final texture. And taking the time to make little adjustments here and there just to try to improve the sculpture. Okay, there we have it. One portrait from imagination. Now it's your turn. Grab some clay and use your imagination to create a unique portrait sculpture without using any references. Be sure to submit the assignment over at Proko.com so that you can get a critique and direct feedback on your work. I look forward to seeing your sculptures. Stay creative, stay productive.